Should we get started, Spence? We might as well, because we know we're tight on time. We've got so much stuff to do, haven't we? So welcome everybody. Hi, my name's Steve Smith. Welcome to the webinar that me and Spence are running today on the successful adoption stuff. Let me start up the slide deck. Spence, I'll rely on you to tell me if something's not quite running correctly on the slide deck. How's that looking?
Yeah, that's good.
Excellent. So, a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know. I'm the CEO of Combined Knowledge. That is my Twitter ping. So if anybody want to hook up on Twitter, you just get your Twitter app on your mobile phone, point the scanny at the square, and it should instantly find me and connect us on LinkedIn. I've got that at the end of the deck as well. So you'll be able to hook up and find ways to connect with me later. And yeah, so that's me, CEO Combined Knowledge. Been doing this for way too long, but hopefully share lots of that experience with you guys today. Spence?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Spence Harbour. I'm Chief Architect at a company called Clear People in the United Kingdom. You've seen my contact details there for Twitter as well. I don't have the fancy barcode-y thing there. But if you want to get me on LinkedIn, pretty straightforward. Just search for my name. You won't find anybody else with the spelling and the combination, unlike Steve. There's quite a few Steve Smiths. Similar to Steve in many respects, been doing this for a very long time. Not just with SharePoint and Office 365, but with similar collaboration platforms, before those things existed. So a lot of what we'll talk about today is actually from those experiences, as well as the things with particular to SharePoint and Office 365.
Cool. Yeah. So we're just going to do a quick 2 minutes about what we where we come from in our sort of business backgrounds and stuff, just to expand on what Spence says, and then we're going to crack on with some specific kind of discussion points to think about on today's theme. So basically, we specialize in the whole education and adoption space in the collaboration arena for Microsoft. It's what we do as a company. It's what we've done since 2003. We, as a company, the whole premise of this, and in fact this webinar kind of derives from a lot of the things we've done as a company historically, is with the aim of education and adoption is all around different tooling and methodologies around how you actually achieve that successfully, right? And as part of a long sustainable one, this has something to do with it, but only part and parcel. So when we talk about support tools, learning tools, training methodologies, historically we're going from a background of the sort of late 90s when we talked about sort of training courses and classroom only IT guys got training, and we've got such a big mix and plethora of sort of content and training people and different personas within the businesses, and the whole world has changed in the way that companies are being educated. So the ability to customize, blend, and build tailored approaches to an adoption education space is actually really critical today. And we were celebrating our we're into our since 2003, obviously, so we're literally celebrating into our 16th year now. And one of the key things that we'll talk about today, as well as especially in my arena that I'm going to discuss, is the tailoring and building that end-to-end piece that then takes you from initiation to the focused rollouts and then building into a long-term sustainable program that would work for that business. So that's what Combined Knowledge does. Spence, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so Clear People actually quite similar with Combined Knowledge in terms of our sort of age, if you will. We've been around for about 16 years, and basically we are a hybrid of sort of technical consulting coupled with user experience focused design. So we do consulting, software development, but also have a product division and also manage services to, and that's really the focus of today around adoption. If you can flip to the next slide, Steve. These are our engagement principles. We basically, are very committed to reinvesting energy back into research and development. That drives the product division, and also, we are a major contributor to some of the community initiatives in this space, which, has a twofold benefit. The first one is obviously the contributions themselves, but it's also that connection with both customers and other organizations that are looking to take this platform a bit further than what it can do sort of with a standard deployment. If we can flip to the next one, Steve. The next, forward actually one more as well. Yeah, so that basically brings us to a thing called Atlas, which is our next generation intelligent workspace. This basically is a way to get up and running very quickly with this platform and contribute more using it. So it's very quick and easy to measure the outcomes. If you can flip to the last one, Steve. Yeah, this just gives you an overview of what Atlas provides, a bunch of utilities on top of a service fabric, which basically enables many of the things that we're going to talk about when we get into the adoption material. It's basically a starter kit for all of these things that are very commonly required, over and above what you might term a classic intranet based on SharePoint or Office 365.
Cool. So that's what we do. Obviously, the theme of this chat is all about a sustainable adoption methodology and sort of ideas and things that we've worked on, projects we've worked on, products we've built or worked on, as Spence just sort of alluded to. But what we really want to do, the whole point of this webinar isn't to push any particular platform or product or anything else. We just really want to share our experiences over the last 20 odd years in this collaboration space, and nearly 20 years, blimey, overriding. Since we first started, collaboration was really kind of kicking off in the Microsoft sphere in the 90s when we first started around the Outlook dashboards and all that kind of thing, team services, which was all the rest of it. But in the last 20 years we've seen a digital transformation as well as a sort of cultural change, collaboration taking place. But in reality, not many have done it right and not many have done it well historically. In reality, that people got away with that in the past because a lot of companies would go from one on-prem version to another on-prem version and kind of use that as a stepping stone to try to fix those problems, those challenges. But one of the key things that, if we talk about building a strategy for a long term in today's 365 evergreen world, which is forever changing, which means users have got to be constantly aware of how to use technology and how we bring them all on the journey, then obviously we've got to also think about the challenges that affect those users. And it could well be IT, it could be end users, power users, business users, CEOs, execs. It's a whole raft of different personas within the business. And one of the biggest mistakes is that this automatic people do they get it, they focus, they change, they move, they challenge themselves, etc. It just doesn't work like that, and it never has worked like that. And especially when you're talking with different audiences, you've got to build a model that actually reflects the way certain groups of people historically work. And anybody there that's heavily involved in email, for example, you'll know as better as anybody that no matter how many times somebody tells you that Teams replaces email and it can drop your email consumption by 40% or whatever, everybody can come up with as many statistics as they like. But the reality is, if you've been using email as your core collaborative email communication structured platform of working with people, doesn't matter what somebody gives you as another tool, you will go to the tool that you've always used. And just giving somebody that tool would never work. And these are the core things. If anybody's ever going to think of a long-term adoption strategy, start with these 4 points as your sort of, this is what we need to make sure we're fixing. Because if you don't start with these known challenges, then you'll actually fail from day one. But in line with that, in line with the fact that we've got all these current methods of working with different groups of people in their current roles and the way they collaborate, we've also got to think about what the alignment is of those sort of key elements to the maturity of the business and the users. And this is a topic that I talk a lot about when sort of we're building a framework around the adoption cycle. Because one of the things that a lot of people think about is we're going to go to, say, 365 or hybrid or even on-prem still. You know, we're going to do this journey into the new platforms, and we're going to use a historical method that we've used, or we're going to change everything completely, and we're just going to move to, say, digital learning or video learning, or we're going to get rid of classroom training and switch it. The problem is trying to do that one-stop shop, you know, cutover doesn't work, because you know, your IT guys, your developers have still got a lot of skills that they need to learn in upskilling from the old on-prem stuff. And from a knowledge transfer point of view, I know for a fact that if you try and teach people IT deep level stuff, or developers, or sort of admins in compliance and stuff like that, if you try and teach them in a cut down online stroke video methodology, you probably lose about 40% knowledge of what you'd actually gain if you were in a classroom being taught properly in a proper style training environment. So, you know, thinking about that maturity model and building up a map of who you've got that's going to be part of the program, how you're going to align the current skills and their current knowledge to what they need to have to do the adoption culture change leap is really important. And it could be different groups of people for totally different things. You know, the compliancy team people are coming from a legal background. Your company might be a legal company, and the way that you would work with these learning and education programs in the adoption cycle would be totally different to the way you would be talking to, say, an engineering company or a financial company, and building that framework around the persona, the current maturity, what people currently know, what people currently do, and then aligning it to where you want to get to, into that kind of vision of, you know, short, medium, long-term achievements in terms of goals for tooling you're going to use, working with different tool sets. I mean, simply moving somebody from saying, we're going to use Office 365, and we're going from an on-prem SharePoint platform where nobody had access to anything externally, to suddenly people using a phone with the mobile app. That in itself is a huge leap. And if you've got users in your business that have never used that kind of mobile experience, that in itself is a adoption piece that you need to put into your planning. Of course, when we talk about maturity, we also need to align it to generational model, right? Because younger people will be more inclined to want to use apps rather than, you know, using a desktop, for example. And again, we have to map this maturity to the age of the users. So when you're thinking about sort of breaking those down into some sort of core skills program mapping, I put 6 here that just give you some sort of bullet points if you were going to try and follow this and try and build this out. These are 6 that you could use as a starting point. You know, you've got your technical competence with the IT guys, you've got your leadership capabilities in terms of your sort of top level execs down, you've got your portfolio side, you know, what sort of tools and management we're going to put in there, business acumen in terms of the business department, the people in there, what do they need, what are they going to be using it for, the business process. We've got marketing and communications around comms channels, awareness campaigns. You know, we did some exercises where we were doing some comms messaging around some bite-sized kind of user interaction stuff, and we were trying to get users used to using the different tooling for some of the 365 apps. And a great way that we were helping them was to sort of get some touchscreen around a common room, and people would come in and it would be like a show and tell, but we'd have their champions in the room with us as well, and it would be a whole communication and marketing exercise in getting people to get excited about, well, excited as excited people could be, but making sure it was tailored around what the business was trying to achieve with that launch of that app coming forward. And of course, once you've got this strategy of this skill base, you know, your business people on board, your business people know what to do, the marketing and comms team aligning that, and then you've got your technical people, your users, your power users. Once you've got all these people in place and you've done one of these successfully, you can then rinse and repeat. For example, if you were launching another app 6 months down the road. So you might be launching, for example, SharePoint Online as a migration, and then you want to move to Teams. You could do that as a stepping stone using the same model once you've used these core skill blocks to align it. So just to put that into a bit of perspective as well, when you're thinking of those sort of apps and 365 or any other product rollout for that matter, as part of this framework that you're going to build, think of that user experience. A lot of times people assume or think they know what the users need or think on everything else, but in actual fact, once you start talking about people about a typical day of a user, or what's important to them, you actually get a very different picture to what, let's call it, historical people think. Or maybe if you go and talk to a service desk and you say, well, what are all the common problems that users have? They'll come up with a list that they troubleshoot. That's not necessarily the list of what a user really thinks that they want to solve as the day-to-day alignment. So think about when you're building this adoption strategy, you need to think about ways that you're going to have quick wins to start with, but then also you'll need to expand on that with adding other elements to solving day-to-day collaborative fixes for the users, or improving collaborative elements as part of that adoption cycle. So you might not be doing all of this from the start. You might be releasing apps over time, but then those apps might change the way a user does a particular function. So as Microsoft release new features, that sustainable movement of you aligning these kind of blocks, these tiles of here's a day at the office for you, here's a function you're trying to perform, and then fixing that with the way to work and focusing on that as part of a education, awareness, comms channel messaging. That bite-sized approach allows you to keep those users engaged as the new stuff changes and you bring out that new collaborative function. And it could be any tool in 365. We're not saying, we're not particularly, just because this has got, specific Teams and Skype or whatever, Yammer and stuff. We're not saying you have to do this, but this is an example of that sort of persona mapping. So when you build that framework, I'm very conscious of time as well, because obviously I want to make sure that myself, Spence, and then we have time for a chat at the end and everything else. You must build a framework that aligns to your business for it to be sustainable. It's as simple as that. If you're not building a framework from day one, in terms of where you're going to start, what the roles are, what skills we need, what we're going to achieve, it's going to be really tough to keep interjecting with sort of new projects that just jump in and try and pick up where the last one left off, especially if it's different teams of people that are being brought in. So it's really important that you build that framework at the very start in terms of what people are going to follow. So for example, we have a sort of a framework baseline that we always go into a company and start with, map it to the conversational pieces we've just been talking about. And then as we start to onboard and train different groups of people, deploy maybe digital training content, work with the LMS team for learning management systems, so you've got persona-based measurement. There's all these different tooling that we need to first understand and build into the framework that the company also needs to buy into as a long-term strategy. And this framework can't just be for the first 2 months, for example. It has to be a framework that is expansive as the business keeps going through the 365 rollout, the quick wins through to the whole, this is where we want to be next year, this is where we want to get to in 2 years. And it could be a raft of different readiness programs, for example. So you've built a strategy program around collaboration, but you've also got a strategy program around compliancy. You've got another strategy around external collaboration. You can bucket these down and have different structures that get the readiness in the business, but it all lies under one framework. And that's the key. You'll find if you build that framework, it will really benefit your long-term adoption strategy. And create a timeline around that strategy. So taking those key pointers and then mapping it to a timeline. I found that companies that try not to do a timeline then run into problems where people sort of get twisted over to other projects, other jobs. And a key part of any timeline, and I know Spencer's got some stuff on this later as well, but for me, a key thing is measurement, reporting, metrics. You've got to have that stuff. I won't spoil Spencer's thunder on that because I know he's got some stuff on that. But there are huge there are huge downsides to trying to have an adoption strategy for the first 3 months and then completely not having anything for the next 12 months after that. Because if you do it right, your onboarding process, your readiness program, your new starter program, whatever it might be, if it's done right, will continue to function and work and keep that pace with the 365 change that's happening in the business. So think about the employee experience as well. It's not just broken down by function, it's broken down by ways of working, so supporting the users, communicating information, how they communicate with other people, the way they collaborate, the way they're going to change from, say, Skype to meeting and voice conversations. Maybe they've used a phone in the past and they're now using a handheld. Different ways that you're going to work with that technology, mapping to those experience layers. And so this is another example of how you can build that framework where you've got the different kind of sectors of how users are going to engage, then align that to the sort of the technology and the groups of people that are going to be involved in that. So I think that was about 20 odd minutes spent. Perfect handover to you on that one, mate, to continue it.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much, Steve. Yeah, so my material is very much going to sort of build on most of the things that Steve touched on. There's quite a lot of clear overlap, and what I'm going to try and present is some of the most common problems or the background to why adoption is traditionally difficult, and then quite quickly switch into some examples of things that will avoid those problems. So one of the main sort of background problems that this whole area suffers from and has suffered from over probably nearly 20 years now is the fact that the majority of these projects are technically driven. And traditionally, particularly in the SharePoint space, the deployment of a new version has been predominantly an IT-led activity. You can see here on this diagram a periodic table which has been produced in the community to help basically explain the plethora of capabilities that are in Office 365. This indeed is actually a little bit out of date. One of the challenges that Steve mentioned is the concept of evergreen. In other words, sort of forever moving goalposts. The platform is changing at an astonishing rate, and so this has been put together to kind of try and help customers get their head around it. And actually the interactive version of it allows you to sort of click into each element. It gives you a bit more of a description of what they do, but it's just an example of, and that's just what is available in Office 365. And so this sort of technology driven or driven by the technology vendors approach is all very well and good. There's a lot of innovation that we can take advantage of, but there's also a massive downside. Of course, this is for IT people relatively straightforward stuff, but for normal users it's completely bewildering, particularly in something like task management, where currently today, just with Microsoft technology, there's 5 different ways you can manage tasks. And then if you add in third-party software as a service offerings into that, which is very common in the enterprise, then there's even more things to consider. So, anything that needs a periodic table is basically too complicated. And we can go ahead and deploy this and, build the perfect deployment, as it were, but it isn't actually going to help with adoption. In fact, it's more likely to hinder it. It's going to compound the problems, the historical problems. So without adoption, there is no return on investment. Can we flip to the next slide? Thank you. So this is sort of a little bit of a joke, but the old man yelling at the cloud. Sometimes people, accuse me of being that person. It was certainly me when my internet failed earlier today as I was trying to get ready for this webcast. Anyway, more tangible examples of this are probably things that you've all come across or have experience of with various customers or perhaps within your company? Fundamentally, that this is from an end user's perspective, there is a resistance to change. Steve touched on this early doors. People who are used to doing something a particular way and comfortable with it and might not be particularly technically literate and have no interest in becoming, known as the person that knows computers. They're going to want to keep using the same approach, the same tools. You've got to basically give them a good reason to move to something else if they're comfortable with what they're currently using, and of course the training and support they need to learn it as well. There's also a distinct sort of theme at the moment in the industry of the vendors themselves, in other words the technology vendors, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, etc., dictating how people should perform their tasks. And the reality is, for successful adoption, it's got to be up to the user population to be able to choose what they want to use when it's appropriate, rather than kind of just following guidance from basically a company who is invested in selling the next version of everything all the time. Then, of course, the things that Steve touched on around onboarding, knowledge, skilling up, and obviously training. As you're probably all familiar, the industry generally, or business generally, is spending less money on training and supporting. The perception is that the software should be so easy that, you just turn it on and anybody can use it. Well, that might be true, again, for the younger workforce who are coming out of school, very computer literate, but, that's not the entire workforce. And it's certainly not the shop floor in a factory. And those kind of things. A good example of this is certainly here in the United Kingdom. If you pay cash in a supermarket, and you will wait longer for your change, and it's not because the person serving you is stupid. It's because they're not as used to doing that as they would have been 20 years ago. The same principle applies, of course, with any tool that we have. From an information worker perspective. And then, keeping up to date can be very frustrating. Everything keeps changing in terms of menu items. You will have noticed with applications like Office, but also things like Teams and OneDrive, now you frequently get a pop-up telling you that something's changed or some new feature has been added, which is an attempt to make it easier, but of course can actually be very annoying sometimes when you just want to get into a file, make some changes quickly and get out again, but you've got even more pop-ups to dismiss before you can do that. And then from a technology point of view, we shouldn't sort of discount the fact that at the same time as we're trying to move the workforce forward in terms of how they utilize IT, we've also got to change the mindset of IT itself in many companies, because for the past 20 years, the classic enterprise has been basically in their mindset of deploying a bunch of servers on premises and running them, and there's a big IT department that is responsible for operating them, keeping them secure, and so on. And so they are challenged with adopting software as a service as well, because it requires a change in strategy and approach from the central IT department in many cases. So those are actually, in a lot of cases, most of the old men yelling at the cloud are the people who work in IT for a large organization. Cool. So if we can flip to the next one, please, Steve.
Yeah, we've got some questions being popped up. So just so everybody knows, we'll deal with questions sort of in the last 10 minutes, I guess, Spence.
Yeah. I'll make sure that I don't go too long, and we've got time to cover those off. So we might need to click another one. This is.
I just realised that I need to click.
I was say that was maybe my best slide there for a moment. Yeah, I mean, fairly straightforward message here, but change is inevitable, and it's essential as well, particularly as companies try and more leverage their IT investments to improve the bottom line. What's otherwise termed a pretty horrendous term, but digital transformation is obviously a big thing, particularly in Europe, and it's seen and perceived as being a shortcut to better profitability. So it's both an inevitable and essential aspect. But of course, at the same time, it's pretty frightening as well. So the key thing about this is, if we can flip to the next slide, is for true adoption is to, and yeah, if you can click again, Steve, because it's got a build in it, sorry about that, is to understand that, oh yeah, there you go, it's to understand the user population and to recognize that, there'll be a small chunk of users who are what could be considered early adopters. They're maybe more tech savvy. They're actually playing around with some of this same technology themselves in the evening for perhaps, supporting their hobbies or social clubs, that kind of thing. And so they're into it. But then there's also another, chunk of users who are the won't change, never change, not interested, and there's a scale here, with some at one end, some at the other, and the majority of the users, not really in either bucket, but there's a varying degree there. And so understanding the user's population within an organization is key. And we've seen this over the years with SharePoint on-premises in particular, where, each project to deploy a new version or upgrade, the intranet from SharePoint, whatever version to SharePoint 2016 or something, and there's a disappointment. We've spent all that money on the deployment. Why aren't more people using it? Why don't people love it, etc.? And it's usually because this is not considered in the project at all. Right? The project is a technical project. It's about servers and capacity management and security and blah blah blah, but it doesn't actually spend any time to focus on, well, why didn't our users like the old system? Did we do anything to make it better in the new deployment, and so on? So without this, you cannot have truly successful adoption, because the focus is on the wrong thing. It's on the technology rather than the users.
Just to chime in on that aspect. Mm-hmm. A classic one of that is where historically we've had customers that have ignored the fact that the users just want to do their job. They just want to do that piece of function that they have to do day in, day out, and they just want it to be as easy and as less challenging. And like Spence just said, they might have been given a way to do it in SharePoint and told to do it that way when they used to do it in a file share. And it was never thought about what they actually need to do, so they didn't think about it, so they just got more frustrated. If you understand that as part of this sort of sustainable adoption, you need to be able to make sure that the users just need to do their job, and that 70% of that user base is exactly that group. And if you do not, as Spence said, if you do not consider that as part of your framework, it will not work in the long term. Yeah,
key aspect. Okay, so that's a bunch of problems that hopefully, for the most part, those are things that everybody is familiar with and had some experience of. So how do we help deal with it? Well, the main way is to make use of a proven adoption process, and bake this into the project delivery. Steve's covered some of this in terms of creating or choosing basically adoption model and tweaking it to suit the organization. But we can, as much experience as we have of the kind of the projects that have missed in this respect, I wouldn't say there's an equal amount, but there's certainly a large amount of projects that have gone through an adoption process and been successful, at least in a measurable way. You can see the benefit of doing it. And out of those successful deployments, if you will, come things that exist in all of them. And so they're the things that are the easy things to pick, And this diagram basically outlines the key ones here from a adoption process, particularly focused from Microsoft technology perspective, but you would expect to see most of these things in classic project management discipline, actually, for any IT project. But of course, everybody talks about those things a lot, perhaps when the project is initiated, but then as the project goes along, they kind of fizzle out in terms of interest. But clearly we need to identify stakeholders. And I've got some examples of this in a little bit, but the important point here is that when we say stakeholders, we're not just talking about the marketing director for an intranet or the CEO and the IT director. It's got to, these stakeholders have to include the people who are going to actually be using the tools as well, the majority of the workforce. And then the idea of identifying and prioritizing business scenarios as well, very important, particularly when we start talking about collaborative composite applications. So if we think of something like a timesheet system or a holiday booking form or an expenses claim report, these are classic examples of things that virtually every company builds bespoke on top of SharePoint, and has some custom code there or a bit of branding or unique requirements. And those sorts of things are often done because they're seen as, well, we need that on the intranet, but there isn't any more prioritization there. And so historically you tend to spend a lot of time and effort on relatively trivial things that perhaps don't have the business impact that some much more simple things could have. And I have a chart on this in a little bit as well. Also, just before we move on, Steve mentioned this in terms of the metrics or the monitoring of your success. If you don't have success criteria and you're not measuring them, you're not in a position to be able to actually communicate the success of the adoption or indeed make changes to what you're doing based on those metrics. So I don't have specific slides on this in this presentation. There isn't time to cover the whole process end to end, but this is of critical importance. If we don't have the metrics, not just in terms of how many people are using the system, but how they're using it and so on and so forth, there's no way to have this be a circular process. It'll just finish at one point and basically it's the same old story as in the past.
Yeah.
So can we, got comments on that, Steve?
Yeah, I was just going to just point out a few things for everybody on that one. So one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that there is a free Power BI adoption pack that you can get for your 365 tenant, for example. And you basically light it up in your tenant and it will show you usage of all the different Office 365 applications. So if you're using SharePoint, it'll show you things like usage of files and sharing and OneDrive and Teams. It's got basically breakdown of all the different services that will show you sort of measured use of the apps. Now, the adoption pack is great in the sense that it kind of shows you that if you are focusing on an adoption strategy around a particular team or a function, you would expect to see usage of that app go up. But if you consider the fact that some companies, a measurement isn't about, I think I'm getting a bit of reverb from you there, Spence. For some companies, the measurement isn't about just the usage of a product. They want to actually measure skills as a continuation. So, for example, we were working with a company recently on building a learning management system integration where we didn't just want to have measurement of who's got what skills around, which application. So, we want to move to teams. Have we got the right skills for teams? Have we got the people managing teams? Have we got people that can support the departments, that kind of service desk or sort of departmental champions? But of course, over time, the product changes. So you could initiate a skills program in January this year, and by July this year, actually those skills are redundant, not totally, but to somewhat, because the products have changed. And this is a huge change of measurement that we've never had to really deal with historically because the products don't change that quick for us. And so the LMS system methodology using SCORM, learning management systems, is basically a way that you can build that skills program with measurement to know how many people have got those skills. And what we did with this particular, what we're doing currently with this particular learning management system is we're building a version database of our training content that if it changes, it triggers a version ID, and in the LMS system at the back end, they'll be tracking that so that when, let's say 20-40% of the team's training changes on our end that's being used in their LMS system, it will actually trigger a new skills program on that persona of people based on the fact that they're no longer skilled enough in that group. So it's a combined thing, right?
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So this is very brief, but it's very clear, measurement from Garneau Report basically that says that 1 out of every 3 projects fail partly due to lack of involvement from executives or senior management. There's no point in proceeding sort of on a digital transformation initiative if senior management doesn't have buy-in. So stating the obvious to a certain extent, but nonetheless, we still see it, on a monthly basis with projects struggling or already on the rocks because of this. So very important to have this engagement at the start. So if we can move forward again. So this slide basically gives an indication of the success of transformation when senior management is involved. It's all about visibility at the end of the day. And you can argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a reality of the modern world, basically, in terms of there is a fundamental requirement for sort of visibility, whether that's driven by social media or not. It's not really to discuss the pros and cons of it, it's just to demonstrate that you can see with a very visible leadership involvement, the success rates skyrocket. And this is different from the previous one. This is from McKinsey. And this is actually quite old as well. If we had an up-to-date kind of study of this, I'm pretty sure the very visible would probably stay consistent, but the not successful would be significantly increased as well. But you can see also, for where the leadership is not involved or not visible, there's basically no extremely successful transformation projects. So, that's to sort of back up my previous slide. So if we can go to the next one, please, Steve. Now this is an example where, the key stakeholders have been identified in early doors in the project, and you can see obviously some key roles there at the top, which are, the executive sponsor, what we've just spoken about, but somebody to actually own success, and that's not necessarily a project manager, that's somebody who's truly invested in seeing digital transformation actually take place. Then we've got the champions, and Steve touched on this as part of his material, but the rest of the units in there are kind of, they're required, but they're sort of de-emphasized to a certain extent. You can see, SharePoint site manager, IT specialist, etc. They're all in there, and they are key stakeholders, but the primary ones that really are going to drive this ability to measure and ability to drive the workforce to adopt there are highlighted at the top. But each project should have a similar diagram to this or a similar chart to this. And of course, in a lot of companies, the IT specialist is also going to be the site manager, and so it's not necessarily these, you need 12 individuals, but you need people taking care of those roles and with those responsibilities. Okay, the next example, if we can move forward.
Well, I was just going to add to that, Spence. One of the things that we found as an education company in the many years and driving that adoption aligning to this is it's also worth remembering for everybody here that all of those roles that are listed have unique requirements in terms of how you educate on board them. The way that you would get champions ready is very different to the way you might get an executive sponsor to be aware of the project against the training lead versus, say, departmental leads versus the SharePoint specialist. I mean, the approach of the education onboarding of those different groups of people is very different in order for it to be effective. You cannot have sort of one or two approaches to these different teams. You may end up with 4, 5, 6, sometimes even a dozen different methods around educating and bringing them on board.
Yeah, so the next sort of 4 slides, I want to kind of skip through relatively quickly in the interest of time, but they're examples that are deliberately simple. You know, it's very difficult to kind of get to more complicated ones and then actually be still talking about the concept and not the actual business scenario itself. But so I mentioned before, you know, one of the key tasks is to identify business scenarios that the project is going to address. And so this is an example of somebody in sales management that wants to have a single version of the proposal that everyone can use and edit and so on, rather than emailing stuff about. Now, I don't think I've actually ever met a salesperson that truly wants this. You know, I think they actually like working with multiple versions and so on. But anyway, let's just imagine this theoretical scenario, right? And, you know, then you can see, okay, well, we're going to do that using a SharePoint site and use, you know, co-authoring with Word and PowerPoint and OneNote and so on. But the important thing here is that these exist for the key things, and to include the bit that says, I know this will be successful when. In other words, what the measure of that success is. There's no point putting it in and then finding out that the sales team, they actually really kind of get freaked out by co-authoring, and so they don't use it and they just go back to the other way, the old way. You know, so but these things are very important as part of the initial sort of project requirements. And then if we can flip to the next one, the next chart, you know, let's say we've gone ahead and done that and we've identified a bundle of different business scenarios, then it's key to prioritize them. And so this chart gives a good example of how you can prioritize it based on the difficulty of implementation versus the business impact it might have. So, for example, if we want to rip out our traditional phone system and replace it with, you know, Microsoft Teams PBX integration, the difficulty of implementation and the cost is, you know, significant, but the impact is huge. Whereas if we want to onboard a new hire into the organization and we want to sort of get them up to speed with all the company processes and information and so on, having a Yammer group for that, you know, is trivial to implement. You basically create it, and but the impact is, you know, it's good for the new hires, but it's a quick win basically. And so you can see this is a way or one example of how you can prioritize the delivery of these business scenarios.
Yeah, and Lincoln, just to add to that, Spence, when you think about this on the previous slide as well, we can quite often call these quick wins, those kind of quick business scenarios that would have a quick impact, low difficulty but a quick impact between low and medium. If you can come up with a bunch of those initials as part of your initial adoption plan, but then you might have some other ones that you want to do down the road, you know, every month or every 2 months or every 3 months, you're releasing new business scenarios for certain teams as they come on board. Those quick wins being, you know, rolled out continuously, that adds a huge amount to that sort of sustainable adoption, because people are constantly engaged all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, one of the key things is with the adoption and delivery project is to not try and approach it like an old-fashioned IT project where everything gets done by March, you know, 2020, and to have it be a continuous delivery, because there is basically no way you can achieve the former, and it doesn't make sense with the software as a service model more generally. Yeah, so this is the penultimate one, and it's an example success criteria, bucketed into different areas like increased adoption, training effectiveness, reduced operating costs, increased productivity, and so on. So you can, very basic thing. This would obviously need to be customized for a particular deployment, but without this, there is no way to measure whether you're being successful or not. Again, it's what you might consider to be fairly standard project management methodology, but as we're probably all familiar with, project management methodology rarely gets actually applied to any kind of IT project. It does get applied in engineering, civil engineering, and the military, but in IT projects, very uncommon, because the project pressure is on the meeting the timelines, and so this stuff kind of fizzles out. But again, because we're in this iterative approach, this becomes so much more important. And that leads nicely into the next one, which is kind of going out on a bang. But is the key message from me really here. As you can see on the left-hand side, the common approach is to basically do most of the technical stuff, and do the rollout, and then you sort of slap user-focused things like adoption, training, communications, competitions to name the intranet, and all those kind of things slapped on the back end of it, or they start coming in towards the end. And that is, the vast majority of projects. And of course, in that situation, it's not going to be early enough, first of all, and it's not going to be substantive enough to have real impact. Whereas the diagram on the right-hand side is basically from successful projects. You can see the adoption trajectory is actually, happening, the majority of it's happening basically at the same time as the rest of the rollout, and so it's got the right amount of resources and it's baked in to the project all up. So adoption is being considered all the way through rather than as a kind of add-on after the fact. And this really is something that we see over and over again have tremendous impact to success, and is basically the main thing that I would advise you to try and do on your projects to improve the chances of successful adoption.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right, Spence. It's a perfect graph to show it, and just to kind of show how we've noticed this exact thing in the way that we work as Combined Knowledge has done in the education space. We historically, where we were training the power users and the IT people, we could have gone into a company and built a training proposal that was maybe 4 pages long about the different ways that we were going to approach that training, 10 years ago. Whereas now, our education adoption framework document that we base it off, that covers everything from those kind of champions, the execs, all the way through to the sort of end users, the IT guys, the SharePoint admins, that whole piece around what Spence was showing in those previous slides. So our framework document that we start with as a starting point for sustainable adoption is now over 20 pages. And that's what we start with in discussion about where we want to go, and it obviously expands based on what we add to it. And that just shows how much this has changed, this industry and the technology, to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And it is that even for companies like us that understand that end-to-end and being able to educate every element and bring them adopting onto the stage, it's literally 5 times bigger in terms of the framework we have to use when we talk to companies about doing this right. So, and that's just one piece of the whole process, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we've got some questions, Spence. So I don't know how long we've got. We've got a few minutes. Let's go and pick on a few quick questions. So I'm just going to grab a few that are on here. So how do we identify business scenarios? So that's the whole measuring, going into the business, figuring out what people are trying to do, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I showed the example of one that's diagrammed, but in terms of how you go about kind of sucking that information up, I mean, a large number of there is a degree to which with all of these things they change based on sort of industry vertical and so forth, but the classic way is to basically go through existing systems and identify all of the key workloads that are deployed there. And when I say workload, I don't mean SharePoint or Yammer. I mean what are these systems, is it a timesheet application? But the fundamental one is to speak to key representatives from different parts of the business to understand what they want to be able to solve, because identifying a business scenario is not coming up with the technology solution first and then retrofitting what the user wants. The example I gave was the sales guy wants a single document to work on, and so that type of thing can be gathered by going and sitting down with the sales director, sales manager, and saying, what are your key pain points, and describe them to me, and then, for many of those, there will likely be a technology solution. So it's all about communications with key representatives from the business at the end of the day.
Yeah. There's another question, it kind of leads on nicely from that, is, when you've got certain people in the department that are kind of picking up the adoption and going with it, when you've got the people, the sort of diehards that refuse to adapt, the age-old problem of, there's the expert in the corner, ask him to do it because he keeps doing it. This is where, and this is answering a question regarding, how do we push people onto the next stage? As Spence just pointed out, communication is key, but having things like active champions, your service desk, having ways to engage the users, which could be, again, having quick wins specifically for those people that are sort of slow to take it up, but also having those local champions, the departmental champions, are the ones that are there to drive that, getting people involved and making sure that they know how to use the tech locally to where they sit. So you don't just have kind of service and help desk sitting at the back behind a phone. It's bringing that support into the business, into the department. And if you have got those local champions, which used to be might be the guy in the corner that was on his own, he's replaced by people, or he might be that person, but they know how to now deal with that. Let's get you on board. Oh, look, we've got some onboarding stuff to help you with that. Oh, look, we've got these kind of quick guides. We've got these videos to watch that are tailored for that experience. It's different ways to get those people engaged, and you have to address that. Absolutely, you have to build that plan. And as also mentioned in that question, what if we've got people putting things from a file share into, say, SharePoint online? How do we make sure that they're using it properly? And that's all about building maybe little workshops, a half an hour thing, just a quick show and tell, focusing on that area.
Yeah, and I mean, also it's a question of recognizing there are going to be, some individuals who just, will not, just not engage. But at the same time, it is actually relatively easy to bring people across to a new way of doing things if they have that kind of support that Steve's spoken about. A good analogy is a shop floor where, there is machines used to cut pieces of cardboard to make a box. Well, that tool changes once every 10 years, but there's never a situation in that business where they'll just change the tool and not provide the kind of support that Steve was talking about, because, obviously that would be very dangerous and you'd have people, in the hospital. But, we traditionally with IT, we kind of steer away from that and just assume that people will be able to pick it up. Well, it really is about the interpersonal champions or evangelists, whatever you want to call them, helping and guiding. And of course, as soon as that is successful with one person, there's a roll-on or knock-on effect. It kind of snowballs, because then once that person has kind of got comfortable with it, and then they also become a bit of a proponent for that as well.
Yeah, couple of good questions here from Cassie. Oh, hey, Cassie. Self-migration, trying to get people to be able to do some things themselves instead of IT trying to do everything for them. I mean, there are some migration tools that can be done locally with users. The problem is most users don't ever want to do that. So it depends what data you're trying to move into Office 365 to structure that. I mean, we've seen problems when people try to do that themselves. They obviously just drag and drop everything into a SharePoint library, for example, and then it just all gets messed up. I've seen some success with self-migration where people have used OneDrive as a way to do that. So OneDrive being the driving force behind that. You've mentioned Teams as a great example of that. I mean, people can use data migration themselves. They can. There are tools out there built in using the migration tool that can migrate straight from their local machine or from a SharePoint straight into SharePoint on premises, straight into a Teams site in SharePoint. So it is possible to do that, and there are built-in migration tools for that. The key is making sure you've got a methodology for those people that you're going to let do that, to have an easy way to follow the step-by-step guide to do it. So
yeah, that's the key thing, having the guide. You know, the technology exists, but if the technology has so many options that without the guide and without a few things sort of constrained, it becomes basically unmanageable. So having that, you know, figuring out how you want the users to do their own migration before you let them do their own migration.
Yeah, and the guide doesn't necessarily have to be a video. It could be a video, but it could also be a quick step-by-step that they have available in an email template. I mean, literally, you'd be surprised how effective that can be.
Yeah, particularly for, you know, personal file share to OneDrive, or I nearly said my site, but I got it right. You know, that's a good example where, you know, that seriously can and has been for one of the world's largest banks, you know, who did a self-service migration in 2018. You know, that was an email and it had 6 steps in, you know, but they'd done the work ahead of time to support it being that straightforward.
And just to answer your other question, Cassie, the adoption pack for 365 uses the free Power BI license, so there's no charge for that. You just deploy it and it's part of the free Power BI, the back end, so it's totally free. There's no license cost at all for that. Another quick question was, I appreciate we're a little bit over, but we'll carry on if people are still listening, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. So a quick question here. So somebody was talking about how do we make sure that things don't get skew-whiff, because, you know, people start being told to use one thing, but then other tools are required in order to use that tool. Yeah, so in the example of planning, you need to have Exchange Online license, etc. So this is a great question because, you know, we've talked about champions and end users and all the rest of it, but don't forget the IT team, right? Because again, a classic failure of adoption in the long term is where one of the particular IT teams owns 365. So you might have the Exchange team own 365. The problem is with that is that there's so many connectivity parts and connected pieces that you need to have an Office 365 IT team. They must be all working together, all in the same thinking, and all skilled up and know how to make that work for them. And that's, you can't go to the business can't build a framework and a plan if your IT team is still siloed and not working together. So you've got to ditch that idea.
Yeah, this all kind of ties back to what I was going on about before in terms of, you know, IT has to transform as well. It has to change, you know, it can't continue to operate in the same old siloed fashion with, you know, fiefdoms of control, because the whole point of software as a service is an integrated platform, you know, and that's true for the Microsoft pieces, you know, which is, as we all are probably familiar with, is a disparate amount of things that they've done a very good job of making them look as if they all tie together, but there's a lot of dependencies there. But it's also equally as true as soon as you start adding in, you know, Box or Salesforce or any number of other software as a service solutions. So yeah, I mean, it's critical that IT transforms and basically starts to operate in a software as a service mindset, because there's no point asking the rest of the business to do that if IT is still running like it was in, you know, 2008, and you've got these, you know, different sort of administrators. You know, we see this with quite a lot of the things will need global administrator rights in the Azure tenant, for example, particularly during the original deployment. Well, it's recommended that you don't have very many of those, and so that can quite often be a point of contention on a project. And again, that's an example of IT trying to do things the old way with the new technology, and that will never be successful.
Yeah. And Geraldine asked a great question around post-project implementation. How do we keep momentum and ensure success is ongoing? Well, that boils back down to what we were saying about you know, the engagement of the champions, the business invoking things like awareness campaigns, lunch and learns, bite-sized learning lesson plans. You could have updated show and tell sessions. So these sorts of investments in continuous awareness programs is key, especially because obviously 365 will change. So, when the sort of power users, the champions, and the sort of 365 team have all identified either upcoming changes to the products or you're rolling out a new feature, you can use that as an excuse to engage the workforce with, hey guys, look what's coming. We're going to show you, there's going to be these lunch and learns, we're going to be pushing out some videos or some guides. So we're going to make sure there's all these different ways that we keep you up to date and aware of what's coming. And there's many different ways that you can push that in terms of comms channels. You can have things being advertised through, for example, communication sites in SharePoint. We can have Teams channels aware of that. So there's lots of different ways you can push it, but you have to have a team that owns that comms methodology. We can't just have one person responsible for doing all of this updates and pushing it out and building comms channels and awareness campaigns. But that is the way to keep it engaged. And it is a new way of working for a lot of companies. And we found that when I talked about my document that's now the frameworks, it's like 20 pages, that's because some of those pages are dedicated to building that framework around how you engage and how you get the people upskilled, ready to do that. So, there are lots of ways you can do it. It depends who your workforce is that determines what works for them and the environments they work in. And that's a key decision point that you have to make right at the early start of your framework, how you're going to deal with that. Another question, is there a standard governance framework document people can download when taking up a new client? I don't think there's any specific governance framework.
Well, no, not really. I mean, the best example of that exists right now is the Office 365 adoption toolkit, and that has some assets in. They're not really templates, they're more kind of starting point. The difficulty with there being a good template is obviously there's a resistance to share them, but also they're very generic, and generic is fine for some things, executive buy-in and so on and so forth, but then as soon as you start to get into like what Steve was talking about previously, it becomes very specific to a company or perhaps an industry vertical. So that's a good start point. I'd recommend that if you do a search using your favorite engine for Office 365 adoption toolkit, that will give you a good start point, but that's basically as far as it goes, because there's a certain amount of IP involved, particularly when a company has gone through this process. It's going to be quite specific to their business, and so naturally that's not the sort of thing that people are sharing widely at this stage. Hopefully, over time we'll get more and more examples of it out there, but right now they're pretty limited.
Yeah, for sure. And you end up building your bespoke ones anyway, we find a lot of the time.
The other thing is dangerous to copy, because what works for Acme Bank is not going to work for Woodgrove Bank, for example, because of the differences in culture between the organisations and so on. So, copying can be counterproductive in some case.
And that's what we found. I mean, that's why, we found when building a framework that when you engage with companies and customers who are doing this sort of thing, it doesn't matter what vertical they're from. They could all be from the same vertical. But we, after you've been doing this for a long time, like we have, the framework we build is our starting point, but you then still customize it at every customer. You can start with a framework that works as a basic to start from. And a lot of companies don't have this framework because they haven't got the experience of doing it for 15 years through the different elements of collaboration. But having that proper framework that you start from is key to then building those sort of elements for your business that match where you're trying to get to.
And also, some companies are much more mature with respect to change management generally.
Yeah.
So if you take the example of a defence contractor, they are, they have 40 years experience of change management, and therefore they're much more likely to have a whole bunch of assets that are already appropriate for this. Whereas if you take a bank, they are less change mature, and therefore it's going to be more new for them, and more of an effort to produce it.
And that's a really good point. I never thought of that because we haven't mentioned really the change management stuff. We've been talking about adoption. In fact, one of the things that I find a lot of people still get mixed up about is change management is adoption. No, they're part and parcel of the same program, but they are totally different approaches and frameworks. So if you're building a change management framework, it is not the same thing as building an adoption and education program. They work in tandem. Hopefully the same teams are involved, but it works differently. So I've got another question here. Actually, we'll probably finish on this one because I've noticed that there's a few people.
Make it a good one, Steve. Pick a good one.
Actually, I do kind of like it. David just said, are there email templates in the toolkit? Yes, there are, David. There are some templates in there that you can get. So yeah, that answers that one. The last one is, and I like this one because it kind of goes back to the IT point. How can you control use of 365 features? You've heard that groups explodes and when people just get access to it and there's no control governance. And we're trying to figure out how to manage all that from Karen. Great question, Karen. And this is all boiling down to the IT group, the team, all the different groups of the old IT working together as administrators and the power users, and they're all understanding how 365 works. So this is why these guys need to have proper training, because there are ways you can actually turn on and off features that are allocated to users. And you can actually, for example, use PowerShell, a command line tool, to actually switch off groups, so only certain people are allowed to create groups in 365. So you can actually control a lot of these things as long as the IT team and the power users know what it is they're trying to control and who's going to manage that. But it's a top-level configuration rather than a low-level configuration. And this is a great example of that.
That's something that we Clear People directly have been extremely successful with after kind of learning the hard way, with all the relatively recent new things, Yammer, groups, teams, and also the associated APIs that those tools offer. We did a significant planning exercise, with internal IT basically to figure out, which people will be allowed to do what. But in order to do that, obviously, as Steve mentioned, it means that that group of IT people have got to get up to speed with what those options are, and and then map it back to the people in the organisation that might be allowed to create a team, for example. Otherwise, even within relatively speaking, a very small company, we would end up with hundreds of teams, and it would be a complete nightmare. Well, we've managed to kind of work around that or avoid that by getting that technical configuration side dealt with. And also, actually, on that point, interestingly, the upcoming Modern Workplace Administrator exam course and associated training is directly targeted at this particular area, and will be very useful there. But also, think about tools as well. So there's tools available that allow you to have a sort of roll-up view of all your various different places, groups, teams, Yammer, etc. And you can see immediately, which ones include external users, and all these kind of things. So, yes, the technical configuration is paramount. You can't be successful without it, but there's also tools that can help afterwards, over and above what you get with Office 365 that let you visualize whether that's successful, and if indeed perhaps you need to change it up a little bit when Microsoft introduces some new thing, or if your business changes, and you need to tweak things a little bit. So it's kind of two ends to that cycle there.
Yeah, spot on. Actually, well done mentioning that, the new exam track, Spence, because we are the previous sort of qualifications and courses around some of those sort of 365 management side. The new courses are really good that are coming out. I've seen some of the early beta of the stuff, so we'll be running those we're getting those on the agenda in the next few months for teaching that.
It was quite a battle to get them to change the focus a little bit, but eventually they agreed, and so we have high hopes.
Yeah. Right. Well, we're definitely at a good old 16 minutes over for questions. I hope those guys that have all stayed on, hope you got something out of it. The contact details for us are on there. Feel free to ping us at any time for any questions on the back of this stuff. It's only an hour. We spend a lot more time doing this in the real world, obviously. But hopefully it gives you all a little bit of an insight into the sort of things that we deal with and the ways that we approach this in the adoption and the sort of change management, the whole life cycle piece. If you want any more info, ping us. We'll get back to you. And yeah, thanks very much, Spence. Much appreciated for being on the call, mate.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody for listening, and hopefully see you again in the future.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll do another one of these soon. So thanks a lot. Take care.